Welcome to the Arts and Oddities podcast with A.M. Hall, starring A.M. Hall. Now, here is A.M. Hall.
Welcome to Art and Oddities with A.M. Hall, where I talk about anything that strikes my fancy, to include all kinds of creative works, from children's cartoons to underground zines, to identity politics and everything in between. My guests and I will discuss how art impacts and reflects culture and counterculture, enables individualism and conformity, and have loads of fun along the way. I am your host, A.M. Hall, aka Anthony Bonafini, aka Galena Storm, aka Aquaces Mancuso. In this episode, I talk about the difficulties of learning a musical instrument as an adult and talk about my personal experiences playing the ukulele. Then, in part 2, Reverend Panik, Bedlam, and I get into a discussion on how to analyze cartoons. I reveal just how obsessed with Steven Universe I am, and we talk about how anime has made Betty Boop more important than you probably thought. Maybe. All this and more coming up now on the Arts and Oddities podcast. So, recently I've taken up playing the ukulele. Uh, about 9 months ago, I had a surgery which caused me to be laid up for about 6 weeks. And during this time, uh, the person who was taking care of me purchased themselves a ukulele and was playing it in front of me. And I was originally of two minds about it. I've never really given much thought to the ukulele before this had happened. Um, but, this person gradually got better and better at playing the ukulele. Eventually the songs started to sound like actual songs. But, and this, and she encouraged me to take it up as well, which I was initially a bit resistant on for various reasons I'll get into in a minute. But I took it up. Um, After a few months, I took it up, and apparently I'm a natural. I had never really taken to something like this quickly before, but not only I ran into a snag. My work has plateaued a little bit on the ukulele. Um, I should get into a little bit about my history with music. When I was a small child, my dad uh, played guitar and took up guitar later in his life, and encouraged me to play guitar as well, which, being a small child, I was pretty enthusiastic about it. At least I remember being enthusiastic about playing, but my dad might remember differently, but that's not for here. Um, the guitar, I worked at playing it for quite some time, a long time, at least a year, but it was too hard for me to play. It was too physically difficult. I did not have language to describe the difficulties that I had at the time, but my fingers literally never formed calluses, and I believe the action was too high on the guitar. Like, I physically did not have the strength in my, you know, child hands to fret the first fret because the action was too high on this guitar that I had. Um, so what I did was I took my dad's capo and I put it literally directly below the nut on the guitar, and that lowered the action. But I didn't I didn't know how to say that to to my dad, and I didn't know how to say that to the guitar instructors that I had as a child. And I never could get my fingers to move in such a way as I could chord, fret the chords quickly enough. I had to play with groups of people where, the other people would fret the chord and then start strumming, and then I would fret the chord and start strumming as soon as, I could. It, it was a problem. So that's why I was initially very hesitant to play the ukulele, because of this experience that I had with the guitar was just it wasn't a positive experience. Um, but when I picked up the ukulele, it felt right. The action wasn't too high. The strings were not steel; they were soft, and they were relatively easy on my hands. And the chords were simpler. There were only four strings instead of six. It was fairly easy for me to play. And so I started playing this instrument, and I started playing actual songs, and they sounded like songs, and it was amazing. But my process has my progress in playing has stalled a bit recently. I haven't been playing daily like I should be. Even if I'm just playing for 5 minutes a day, I really should play for 5 minutes a day. I'm finding that the type of music that I want to play is different than the type of music that I thought I wanted to play, which, I that's neither here nor there, but it's all right. Um, I really wish my dad had thought to give me a ukulele when I was a child. It is a really good starter instrument for a child, given that it's physically smaller and physically easier to play. But this was back in the 90s, and ukuleles were pretty obscure at that time. I guess the moral of the story is, don't be too reluctant to try things out. Even if you have had a bad experience in the past, don't be so reluctant to try something that is kind of sort of similar. Be you might find yourself pleasantly surprised. So I am here today again with the lovely Reverend Panik Bedlam. Hi, Panik,
Hi, Evie for short.
or Evie for short. And today we're going to be talking about cartoons, and we're talking about analyzing cartoons. Can you tell us why we should analyze cartoons, Evie?
Well, you need something to do while in your jammies eating cereal on Saturday morning, right? Like any art, particularly popular art, is cartoons are a way of commenting on society. And one of the things that cartoons have that's really nice is because they're abstract, because they're a simplification, you can kind of hide higher ideas in them. So analyzing them, it's a useful nut that you can crack.
How do we analyze cartoons?
Well, there's different methods, as you're aware from your Steven Universe blog.
I run a blog about the symbolism of Stephen. I'll put that in the show notes.
One of the things that I made up for you was a chart talking about a system that I use that I often call the four levels system. But you can use almost any literary method of analysis if that you want, but
It says here we've got four levels. The first level is a literal interpretation.
that's essentially like the first time you watch something, watch it and take it for the story that it is. Like, don't try to find the deeper meaning the first time. You might recognize some stuff if you're good at this sort of thing, but just watch it for the story. Take it on its own terms.
The second level is allegorical interpretation.
I probably used that word wrong, but essentially what it is the level at which it's teaching a lesson. Like, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a deep lesson, whatever the show's trying to relate. There are certainly some cartoons that are more adult cartoons with cynical lessons at the end.
Hey, stealing is
Yeah.
bad.
But and you get it kind of ham-fisted back in like the GI Joe cartoons, knowing is half the battle. But even if their only message is buy the toy, that's a lesson, and that's an underpinning at the second level.
The third level is sociological interpretation.
Well, that's where you start to get outside of what the actual story is about, where you start looking at isolated interactions between characters, looking for specific symbols and things like that, and what the creators of the show might be trying to say about how society ought to be run, or trying to recognize aspects of society. This is where you get into euphemism, where characters represent one sort of group. The old standby that the Smurfs are communist, that's a read at this level.
Ah, I see.
Regardless whether you agree with it or not.
The fourth level is metaphorical interpretation.
This is where you start getting into the stuff that makes you sound like a crazy person at parties, but it allows you to do a lot of deep reading and kind of catch foreshadowing that isn't obvious. It's where you start looking at the show as nothing but an assemblage of symbols. You don't really need to look at the story itself, but you're looking more at the motifs and how they repeat and how these circumstances overlap and intertwine with each other and stuff on various levels. And it lets you create different connections between different parts that wouldn't normally or wouldn't obviously connect. Like a theory you were saying about Steven Universe the other day that's a good recognition of that is Mr. Greg, is it?
Yeah, it's Mr. Greg, and suddenly Greg and Pearl are dancing, and they each turn blue and yellow, and Steven becomes like particularly pink. And there's this theory that Greg and Pearl are supposed to represent blue and yellow diamond at that point.
That's a very sophisticated type of reading, and it's that sort of thing that you're looking for on the fourth level. In Steven Universe, anytime a character says or does anything in, through, or around a door, it represents something very strong about that character, because the whole thing about Steven Universe is transversing doors, getting to the next room, going down halls, reaching your potential, that sort of thing. A lot of transitions.
We're certainly using Steven as a...
Well, we could switch to Star, but...
Anyway, there's also the fifth level, the meta level. I think I'm a little bit better at interpreting that one than you are. The meta level is what's going on in the actual world. Like, hey, the reason that character on screen there isn't saying anything is because their voice actor wasn't available that week.
Yeah, that one I usually don't list because it doesn't have to do with the story directly, but like even when you look at filmmakers like Stanley Kubrick and stuff like that, who is very hyper-controlling, there's unintended stuff that he didn't mean. Like, you can be as controlling as you want to be, but there's always going to be secret meaning that shifts its way in there. But this whole system is not like something I contrived out of nowhere. It's not like I completely made this up. And you're kind of familiar with the foundation of it with a book you recommended to me at one point, which essentially the Kabbalistic method of reading the Torah.
The Mystery of the Aleph. It was a book I found in the bargain bin, of all places.
Yeah, these 4 levels are essentially what people do in traditional Kabbalah and to some lesser extent in Western Kabbalah, though they tend to apply a lot of the Hermetic teachings as well, which allows different special secret readings, because mystical systems are all about figuring out what symbols and stories mean and how to teach lessons in allegory and how to tell interesting stories and react to the social situation you're in. And how these people actually got to the nitty-gritty on this, yeah, there's a 5th level too. It's no big secret in Hollywood or any of the places that they make these things. The academic Joseph Campbell, his revolutionary book, specifically Hero with a Thousand Faces.
The Hero's Journey.
Things like Star Wars, which his book helped inspire George Lucas to. You know, that fits into it as well, but one of the other influences that tends to go unsaid but still shows up a lot is how influential popular magic tends to get into this. People can talk about the popularity of Wicca and stuff, but Aleister Crowley and his religion of Thelema has actually had a larger influence on popular culture, to include things like cartoons and such in shows like Steven and Star, where there are magical themes. You get a little bit of that, like you get a little bit of Discordianism implied in the new My Little Pony show, which I'm not a deep study of, but that one's really clever too. You get so far back as the rock and roll guys, like he's on the Sgt. Pepper album. Jimmy Page with Led Zeppelin certainly was into that. And, you know, this stuff has worked its way through, like Alan Moore and Grant Morrison are both chaos magicians, and they're both comic book writers, and comic book writers help make movies now. So this stuff, it's not in a vacuum. And one of the things about Aleister Crowley that's interesting is he came up with a lot of the same ideas, that there's an underpinning continuity to all these different stories. His goal was different than Joseph Campbell, who went out into the woods and read a lot of psychology and mythology books. Crowley went to a lot of these cultures and heard their stories and figured out how they interpreted stuff. So that's always an interesting thing.
Okay. Let's talk about how cartoons have advanced across time.
Okay.
Let's talk about like cartoons in the 90s and how they were different from cartoons from the 70s and cartoons from even earlier.
Well, cartoons are still, like, if you have a broad scheme in history, like, they're still a relatively new technology. Edison came up with that spinning machine that showed the horses running.
Oh, yeah, the one with the horse.
There were other magical lantern style sort of things and fairy cameras and stuff from that time period, but a lot of the stuff was usually very fantastic or very visceral, a lot of action sort of movements and stuff like that.
And, I feel like a lot of the cartoons for children, especially back in the early days of cartoons, they focused on a lot of sight gags. Like, I remember one where there was a woman in a veil, and the boy character, in order to kiss her, like, pulled a string on the side of her veil, and her veil opened up like a curtain in order to for him to kiss her, and then like pulled the string back and her veil moved back.
Like essentially you're talking about the kind of period that Walt Disney came out of, like what in music they tend to call the pre-war era.
Yeah.
And yeah, about that time, it was still mostly a visual media. There was such a technical difficulty with a lot of it, but a lot of that was popular. Anything that didn't necessarily need sound, that could just have music and some sort of entertainment could be had just in the movement of the thing, that sort of went. You could analyze that stuff, but it was a very primal id sort of thing that you were analyzing. There was a lot of kind of bouncing energy in a lot of those things, but some of the more advanced ones were like Betty Boop, Felix the Cat. They tended to get into some stuff, like there's some Betty Boop ones that are a little bit risque if you start looking into them. As you come up into the actual wartime,
the wartime era,
you get into stuff like Looney Tunes and stuff,
which they were far more slapstick at that time, and I think that was part of the zeitgeist of the wartime. Was just the humor was it was slapstick.
But instead of just this subconscious flow of images like the earlier cartoons, you started getting an actual continuity. There might not be a full plot going on, but like, some cat chasing a mice, Hunter chasing a rabbit.
Tom and Jerry type thing, and Bugs Bunny changing into a woman's outfit to full Elmer Fudd.
But as Robert Anton Wilson talks about with Bugs Bunny a lot, to a joking degree, you're starting to get in this period into actual pagan god archetypes, like the coyote and Roadrunner is coyote in a Native American sort of sense.
One of the things we also have to remember about those older cartoons is that they didn't have television just yet. In order to see a cartoon, you had to go to a cinema and watch a cartoon. And in those days, you didn't file into a theater at the start of the show and then file back out again the way we do now. In those days, you paid to get in, and you could wander from theater to theater, and they would just play stuff.
Yeah, the novelty of it that time, you didn't need to have anything that great either. Like, it was starting to wear off, and they started to have to up their game as television came around. The novelty was improving radio at that point in time, and a lot of the stuff that was serial on radio was starting to become like serial live action or serial animated features in the cinema. So, like, I seem to recall more, I think it's in the 50s, you got John Carter of Mars as a cartoon. You started to get comic book characters like Superman and stuff. That's when those cartoons started to become popular.
So in the 70s, we started to see cartoons more like He-Man, more like...
Well, no, that's a little bit more in the 80s. 60s,
okay.
70s, the interesting thing about that is you had Schoolhouse Rock is a little later than what I'm thinking, but that stuff like that, they were simple, low produced, but they were starting to have actual stories more sophisticated than, somebody chasing another thing. There was...
Whenabouts was Scooby-Doo?
Scooby-Doo's a little more in the 70s, but that's a good example. Scooby-Doo's sort of in there, but that's in the popular current. Yogi Bear's in there too, where it's still sort of park ranger chasing the bear, but you're starting to get an actual story sort of woven in there. You had movies that would come out.
But I feel like the moral on those was, those meddling kids, and the monster was always the humans.
That certainly kind of came up, but you get those sorts of things a lot more too in the background in the 60s and the 70s. You get people like Ralph Bakshi doing like Fritz the Cat, Hey Good Looking, and all that stuff, and he worked all the way up through Cool World was like the last big hurrah he had in the 90s that I'm aware of. But there was a lot of underground stuff that was just weird. In the 70s you got heavy metal, which I watched a whole bunch when I was a kid. That fascinated me, that green orb.
Oh yeah, I think you showed that one to me. That was
with the Lochnar.
Oh yeah.
But as you're starting to get into that, you're getting into real mythological motifs, things that are intentionally like surrealistic, which the surrealistic movement was kind of a just before and especially during and after, you start getting that influence. Like Disney, for example, it wasn't finished until I think the late 90s, early 2000s, but Destino or whatever it's called, the Salvador Dali one that he did, you start getting real psychological themes showing up in these, and not just the superficial like god archetype of Superman or whoever or things like that. But as you get into the 80s and 90s, that's where you start getting things like He-Man and G.I. Joe that I mentioned, Gems, another one, Rainbow Bright.
I'm thinking about Ninja Turtles, too.
Ninja Turtles are a little to the end of the 80s, closer into the 90s, but the 80s are a little different because there was such a commercial aspect to
the whole point of children's cartoons at that point was to sell toys.
And then to shove a moral onto the end.
If you were lucky.
I remember watching G.I. Joe and Gem, like, back to back, I seem to recall, but those things would have stories that would go from episode to episode. There was kind of a soft reset in there, but they'd still kind of keep to a story.
The Joker always came back at the end of even though he died at the end of every Batman episode, he would always come back.
He didn't die always, but yeah, ambiguous ending.
He would, at one point he fell into a smokestack. They never explained how he survived that, he just came back.
But as you start to get into the 90s, people kind of saw this and kind of started to comment on it, like the Animaniacs, which had the Wheel of Morality at the end, which made a blatant mockery of that sort of aspect, and that's about when you started getting into what we kind of consider the modern age of cartoons. Like The Simpsons had started to move out of what it started as. We started getting Family Guy in the early aughts, which they have a soft reset instead of a hard one, so characters advance. But you actually started also getting cartoons that did have full, like Invader Zim had a little bit of a reset if something too wacky happened, but they were really trying to go for a specific arc with a beginning and an end with that one. So
but and contemporary cartoons these days do have arcs, and I think one of the reasons for that is because of the influence of anime from Japan.
Absolutely agree with that. Anime in Japan, in a lot of cases, they have a lot of school drama where the whole point is the story. There's no exciting, bright colors and stuff like we think of in cartoons. And a lot of that did start to make its way over. Like King of the Hill's a good example. Before the show, you mentioned Hey Arnold, which had some exaggerated stuff, but it's slice of life kind of thing. You still get that in shows like Clarence on Cartoon Network.
Rugrats too, and and Hey Arnold and Rugrats and similar shows on Nickelodeon back in the 90s. They were kind of slice of life, but they weren't over the top.
But with the Nicktoons, you also started getting things like Ren and Stimpy and Rocko's Modern Life, which, if you get past...
I hated those shows.
They're not for everybody, but the gross aspect was kind of there on purpose to kind of ground the show in a physical reality, despite the fact that they were saying really absurd things. But that kind of surreal absurdism, like I was saying about surrealism, it's trying to cut to the subconscious truth. It's trying to get to what's really there. And I think both of those shows are good examples and led into what we're kind of in now, which is the post-surrealist sort of environment, and where we're aware that we're doing it, so you get into that fifth level that we were talking about, that meta level, where you're so focused on the metaphor, but you have to kind of be aware of how the show's produced. Like, or else you don't catch some of the jokes. Family Guy is notorious, and Rick and Morty is certainly excellent.
Rick and Morty is certainly like... It's like the offspring of Ren and Stimpy and Rocko's Modern Life, I think.
I think it's a little bit more sophisticated than that, but also a little less in some ways, too.
Definitely along the same family tree.
But I think when you were saying about the cross-culture with anime, because it's not just how we advance through time, because as Americans, we're pretty new as a culture, so we have to develop our stories over hundreds of years like everybody else. We brought some stuff with us, but we're finally still figuring out what we're about. But there's some back and forth as globalization started kicking in the 90s with the internet and stuff, and anime went from being a fringe thing that you imported because you like Voltron or like Sailor Moon or something, but as the internet came about and people started actually moving stuff back and forth, stuff started influencing each other. Anime comes out of a pretty interesting place because it's not exclusively out of Japan. Like, it has a strong Edo period influence in its visual style. Some aspects of Chinese landscape painting kind of fits in, especially in things like Studio Ghibli films.
I understand anime was also influenced by, early American cartoons.
Yeah. Before the isolationism of World War II, they had stuff that came in before they kind of shut everything out. And it was mostly things like Betty Boop cartoons, those early cartoons you were talking about that give anime a lot of its look. But it also, the other thing was German expressionism. So a lot of what you look at is exactly what it is on the inside. The mask is the thing. And you get a lot of that with anime.
Right.
A lot of its cartoon demeanor actually serves that aspect. So it's like two parts Edo period woodblock paintings, one part Betty Boop, and one part Metropolis by Fritz Lang. It's really interesting, and it goes the other way too. Like, anime is being influenced more and more by things that they're interested in. Like, Sailor Moon had sort of a weird hermetic symbology to it, and that shows up in things like Full Metal Alchemist as well. If you're into weird dark anime that kind of borders, but it doesn't border, it's pretty much pornography. You get into Bible Black, that actually has real thelemic stuff in it. Like, they make direct reference to Aleister Crowley. So, like I said, it's sort of a proof, and there are people who watch that not necessarily thinking it's anything exciting, just it's peculiar. People in Japan who get upset about this a little bit because just like you get conservative Christians here in the South saying that things are trying to bring back pagan themes, in Japan the Shinto priests are worried that Christianity is removing their pagan virtue. So,
we'll probably go into this a little bit more deeply a little bit later. Clearly we have lots to say.
We can probably get into some specific stuff later on.
All right. Well, that's it for this segment. Stay tuned as we wrap things up. Thanks for listening to the Art and Oddities podcast with A.M. Hall. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and give us a good review, or hit the like button if you're listening via YouTube. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/oddartpodcast and on Twitter at twitter.com/artodditiespod. The production and editing of this podcast has been provided by Reverend Panik Bedlam, and without her, it would not exist. Please support our Patreon at patreon.com/panicbedlam. That's PANIKBEDLAM, all one word. Show notes are available at panicbedlam.com/podcast. We are currently having a problem with our web domain, so if that link isn't working, try the slightly longer sites.google.com/site/panicbedlam. We hope to have this worked out shortly. Next episode, I'll talk about my experiences with writing fiction, and then I'll be interviewing Mr. Teej 66 of Mr. Teej 66's movie reviews on YouTube. Search for Mr. Teej 66, all one word, and I'll put a link in the show notes. Don't miss it.